Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Deploying Windows 7 lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, we'll start out by discussing the GlobalMantic's Windows 7 deployment plan. We'll then discuss some Windows 7 deployment enhancements, and I'll go over some specific lesson goals that we have for what could be one behemoth of a lesson if we let it get too long. We'll talk about some specific deployment types that are available with Windows 7, as well as some pre-deployment tools that you can use to make your Windows 7 deployment go a little more smoothly. You'll learn about the difference between thick and thin images, and we'll go over some other deployment strategies that you can use to make your Windows 7 deployments just a little bit more successful. Because there are a lot of tools that are available to handle Windows deployments, you need to understand some of the tools that are out there, including the image capture tools, as well as some image deployment options that you have when you begin your Windows 7 deployment project. We'll then look at the overall capture and deployment process overview. You'll get a quick peek at the user state migration tool, and we'll talk about an automated installation method that you can use to deploy Windows 7. The GlobalMantic Corporation runs a lean and mean IT shop. They can't afford to send IT staff to visit each and every computer in each and every location to facilitate deployment of new PCs. From a business need perspective, organizations that have more than a few PCs really don't want to handle a manual deployment strategy. There are a lot of manual labor and travel costs that would result in significant expense to a fully manual deployment process. Managing desktops already has a relatively high cost associated with it. Therefore, the use of automated deployment tools can help automate this process and bring down costs for the organization. For its deployment plan, GlobalMantic uses the following deployment strategy. They're going to start by using what's called a thick system image. This includes the applications and Windows updates right in the system image itself. So when they actually capture that system image and deploy it to other machines, it'll already include its applications, including Microsoft Office. They're going to use a light touch installation that takes a lot of the manual processing out of the deployment, but does still require some human intervention. This is as opposed to a zero touch installation, which we cannot use because GlobalMantic does not own System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2, nor are they currently using the Windows deployment services for Windows 7 deployments. From a process perspective, GlobalMantic actually images their machines at headquarters and then ships the machines off to regional offices. The machines are pre-deployed so that all of the software already exists on the desktop, and all the user has to do is turn it on and get started. Now, as I mentioned, GlobalMantic does not currently own System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2. However, if you'd like to learn how to use System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2, I did a video for Train Signal last year on this particular topic. And you can see the link on your screen. And in this video, you would actually learn how to do a fully automated zero-touch method for deploying Windows machines. You really do need a more comprehensive tool than just a basic deployment system to do this zero-touch stuff. And that is the end of my shameless plug for another product that I created for Train Signal. If you've done Windows deployments before with some of Microsoft's older tools, you're probably going to appreciate what Windows 7 brings to the table. There are a number of deployment enhancements present in the Windows 7/Windows Server 2008 R2 package that you can take advantage of to really streamline deployment processes. Windows 7 optimizes deployment with an improved driver handling mechanism. This is called dynamic driver provisioning. This reduces image sizes by dynamically matching drivers to existing hardware during deployment. These drivers are then pulled from a central store. So you don't have to just start sticking drivers anywhere and everywhere in your images because you have slightly different hardware configurations on machines. This actually keeps your image sizes smaller and makes it a little bit more efficient as you stream those images to new desktops. Windows 7 also includes multicast multiple stream transfer. This allows you to deploy multiple images simultaneously across networks. Now, this requires some additional server-based tools in order to work. You have to have Windows deployment services up and running on a Windows Server 2008 R2 machine. Basically, by using multicast, you're able to deploy multiple machines at the same time in a very efficient way. Perhaps one of the most exciting developments in Windows 7 deployment is around the concept of virtual hard disk images. VHD files provide additional deployment and operational flexibility. You actually don't have to capture a hard drive image into a file necessarily like you used to have to do, and then push that entire file out to a new system. You can actually capture an image into a VHD file, which is a virtual hard disk, and then directly use that virtual hard disk file on a system. So basically, you're not pushing out the entire file system to a new machine. You're pushing out a VHD file, which the machine is then using directly. So it's a little bit easier to manipulate. And basically, overall, there's a streamlined installation and file migration process, which provides a better installation and deployment experience, which overall will help to lower costs. We're going to stick to some specific lesson goals in this particular lesson. There are simply too many deployment options to cover in a single lesson. In fact, there could be an entire course dedicated to deployment from TrainSignal, and you still wouldn't get through everything. There's a ton of information and options available, and this is one area where you're going to have to truly study very hard if you want to pass the exam and make sure that you understand the various deployment options. You're going to need to practice and practice and practice and practice some more on the deployment options with Windows 7. There are a ton of different options. Our goal for this course is to simply understand some of these deployment options and to cover a repeatable, documented, real-world deployment scenario. The ultimate goal is so that you can apply the lessons that you learn through understanding this process and cover a real-world scenario so that you can move to other deployment needs as necessitated by your particular requirements. Basically, I want you to understand what goes into creating an image, capturing that image, and then pushing that image out to other machines before you start getting into things like completely automating your deployments and things like that. If you don't understand these basic foundational elements, you're not going to be able to understand the more advanced elements that come along with zero-touch installations and the like. There are three basic deployment types that you can work with Windows 7. The first one we already covered in the lesson entitled Installing Windows 7, and this is a fully manual deployment. This would be the kind of deployment where you walk around with a physical Windows 7 DVD, pop in each computer, and manually run through either an installation or an upgrade process. This is really fine in a lot of instances, particularly if there are a small number of computers. If you have 5 or 6 systems, why bother to spend a lot of time learning about deployment options just so you can install these systems hopefully one time? The next option is called a light touch installation option. This is well suited for medium-sized organizations that may not have a need or a desire for a more automated deployment system. This is often used in conjunction with a thick system image, but you can also use it with a thin system image, assuming you have other software behind the scenes that can handle things like software deployment and Windows updates. A zero-touch installation is sort of the panacea when it comes to a deployment system. This is best suited for large distributed organizations that deploy new systems and applications in a very non-centralized manner. Most often, zero-touch installations are used in conjunction with thin system images. And we'll talk about thick and thin system images pretty quickly. As in right now. A thick image is a complete system image that has all of the applications and updates that you need for your users. For example, you may create a system image that includes Microsoft Office or your accounting package or whatever. Now, these images will take longer to deploy to individual computers because they're so much larger than thin images, but this results in an immediately usable system upon completion of the deployment process. A thin image, on the other hand, is a minimal system image, often simply the operating system and nothing more. Applications and updates are installed either manually after the fact or through the use of some other software management system, such as System Center Configuration Manager 2007 or AppV. Now, a hybrid system is a combination of thick and thin image types. You may go ahead and deploy a system that includes all of the updates, for example, but not include applications. And in that case, you'd be using a thin system image that includes updates, so it would be more of a hybrid type image. You're not going to come across the term hybrid image all that much, but you will hear the phrase thick and thin images thrown around here and there. In this lesson, Global Mantix is going to be focusing on thick images, and you'll see that in action in just a few minutes. Microsoft makes available two pretty important pre-deployment tools that you should consider using before you move on to your Windows 7 deployment. The Application Compatibility Toolkit, as implied by its name, helps test applications for compatibility with Windows 7. This tool does require some additional backend infrastructure in the form of a SQL server to house reporting data, so make sure that you have that in place. The second tool, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, or MAP, will perform a complete audit of your existing environment and provide you with inventory, assessment, and reporting capabilities to assist in your Windows 7 rollout planning efforts. Both of these tools are beyond the scope of this course, but they are important tools to take a look at if you're looking at deploying Windows 7 in your own organization. There are, however, some tools that are well within the scope of this course, the primary tool being the Windows Automated Installer Kit, or WAIK. I don't like to call it WAKE, so I'm just going to call it the Installer Kit throughout this lesson. The Installer Kit is a collection of tools that are designed to assist in the deployment of Windows 7 systems. And as its name implies, it's a collection of tools. So we have a list of tools on the screen, including the Windows System Image Manager, or SIM. This creates and manages unattended Windows setup answer files, and you'll be using this later on in this lesson to create an answer file that will help you do a mostly unattended installation of Windows 7. If you've used Microsoft's older deployment systems, you'll be familiar with SysPrep, which is a tool that helps provide a generalized image of a machine that you've created. Now, by generalized, what that means is all of the specific identifiers, including its security identifier, name, and all that information, has been stripped from the system image to make it possible for that machine to be deployed as new. However, SysPrep does not remove the system applications and such. So you could create a system image with Microsoft Office and all of the other software that you want to have in your image, SysPrep it to remove the system name and other identifiers, and then push that image out to other machines in the organization, basically as is. This is facilitated through the use of a tool called ImageX that's used to capture, create, modify, and apply Windows images. We'll use ImageX later on in this lesson. The Windows Pre-Installation Environment, or WinPE, is a very minimal Windows system that's used to deploy Windows and create and capture images. You'll see this later on in this lesson as well. We'll also just quickly touch on the User State Migration tool, which allows you to migrate user information en masse from older versions of Windows to Windows 7. Now, another tool called the OSCDIMG creates an ISO image of a WinPE installation. In order for that WinPE environment to work, it has to be bootable. So you can use this tool that I mentioned just now, OSCDIMG, to create an ISO image of a WinPE environment that you then burn to a DVD and then boot from. And we'll do this in this lesson. Here's another look at the image deployment options you have with Windows 7. The manual process we did discuss in the Installing Windows 7 lesson in this course. We'll be talking about a semi-automated option here in this lesson. But there are two other options. You can use the Windows Deployment Services along with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010, or you can use System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2. Both of these options are beyond the scope of this particular lesson. The Windows Deployment Services and the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010 provide some additional powerful capability that you should certainly explore before you go off and work on a deployment project or take the exam for the 7680 test. Now, the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit provides powerful scripting capability that allows you to automate a number of tasks, including joining a machine to the domain and a number of other items. System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2 can also incorporate Windows Deployment Services and the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, as well as some additional capabilities. This is discussed in TrainSignal's System Center Configuration Manager 2007 R2 course. Again, we're going to focus on the semi-automated option in this lesson. Speaking of which, here's a look at a capture and deployment process overview that we'll be following throughout this lesson. We're going to start by creating the capture and deployment environment. We're going to have a technician machine that will install the Windows Automated Installation Kit 2 in order to be able to use the tools necessary to create and manage images. Next, we'll build and validate an answer file. We'll then build a reference installation of Windows 7 to which we'll install Office 2010 and make a couple of other minor adjustments. We'll then create bootable Windows PE media. This is what we're going to need to be able to take the next two steps, which are to capture the installation, which can be to a network or to a VHD file. We're going to use the network option. And to deploy a new computer from a network or a VHD file. And as you may suspect, we'll use the network since we're capturing our installation to the network. There are a number of prerequisites that we have to meet in order to get this installation environment up and running. From a software perspective, we need the Windows 7 media. We need either an ISO file or a DVD we can use in a number of different instances throughout this next process. We also need the Windows AIK. I've downloaded the Windows AIK to the technician computer for this lesson. From a hardware perspective, we need a technician computer or a management computer as is noted here. This is a computer to which we'll install the Windows AIK and to which other tools can also be installed, such as the map tool that we mentioned before. We then need to have a reference computer, and this will be a new computer that we can use as a sort of a template for the overall deployment. This should be a system for Global Mantic that matches from a hardware and software perspective what most people are going to need. Next, we'll need a target computer. This will be a brand new computer to which we'll deploy a newly captured image. So we're going to use the management computer to create the deployment environment. We're then going to use a reference computer to create and capture an image. And then to a target computer, we're going to deploy that newly captured image. And it should go without saying, but all systems have to be connected to the network. If we're going to be capturing this image to the network, all of the systems are going to have to be on the network in order for this process to actually work the way it's supposed to. Step one of our process is going to be to create the capture and deployment environment. The target in this case will be the management computer or the technician computer on which the WAIK will be installed. The purpose is to install the Windows AIK and make available the tools that are necessary to create, capture, and deploy a Windows image. In order to do this, you need the Windows AIK, which you can download from the link you see on your screen. I'm now going to move over to the management computer and I'm going to install the Windows AIK. As you can see, I'm on the management computer and I've got the WAIK CD. I've copied it to the hard drive. I'm going to double click the Start CD application that comes with the Windows AIK, and this is going to start an installation wizard just like the one you see on your screen. Now, before we get started on the rest of this, I want to show you that the Application Compatibility Toolkit is available as a link on this installation window. In fact, if I click the Application Compatibility Toolkit option, it'll start Internet Explorer, and you'll see that it provides a link to the version 5.5 of the Application Compatibility Toolkit. What I want to show you is that there are a whole bunch of files. There's a full deployment guide, there's an FAQ, a README, and as well as an installation and some quick start and step-by-step guides. The point is that there's a lot of information available in this Application Compatibility Toolkit. Earlier in this lesson, I mentioned that this could be a course in and of itself, Windows deployment that is. The Application Compatibility Toolkit is one part of what could be that full course. I highly recommend that you download and test and play with the Application Compatibility Toolkit in your own environment. Likewise, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit comes with some files as well. And you can see them here on the screen, including a Getting Started guide, sample documents, as well as the installation file. Again, I do recommend that you download and play with the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. The Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010 is also available for download via this screen. This is a recommended deployment method from Microsoft that you can use to fully automate or mostly automate the Windows deployment process. And again, there are a number of files that are associated with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. And once again, I do recommend that you work with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit on your own to learn about its capabilities and features. But we're here to install the Windows AIK. So I'm going to click the Windows AIK Setup option. And it's going to start an installer just like you've seen in any number of other applications. On the main screen, I'll click Next. I'll agree to the license terms and click Next. It's going to install the files to C:\program files Windows AIK, which is fine, and I'll click Next, and Next again. And the Windows Automated Installation Toolkit is now being installed. I will warn you, this is a very large download, so it's about 1.66 gigabytes, so it's going to take it a while to download, and it does take it a minute or so to install. And when the installation is complete, you can click the Close button, and you can also close the main installation screen. And when you're done, you'll notice that there is a new item on the Start menu for the Windows AIK. And we'll be working with this tool later on in this lesson. The next step in the process is to build and validate an answer file that will be used to configure Windows settings during installation, such as Internet Explorer settings, network settings, and a few other settings that we're going to go through as part of this demonstration you'll see soon. This will all be taking place again on the management computer, and for this you're going to need the Windows 7 media, a floppy disk or other removable media such as an external flash drive, to which you're going to save a new answer file. You'll also need the Windows System Image Manager tool, or SIM, which is part of what we just installed, the WAIK. In the next step of this lesson, we're going to need both the Windows 7 media and the floppy disk or removable media that you create in this part of the lesson. Both will have to be present in our reference computer in order for the answer file to work properly. I'm going to show you the screen that we see here before we go over and do a demonstration. We're going to include the following customizations in our answer file, including the setup user interface language, partition creation and modification information, the location for the OS image, some user data information, and then what we call reseal and the out-of-the-box execution environment information that will make sense in just a couple of minutes once we get over to the answer file. These are the items we're going to include in our answer file. But there are a number of steps we have to take before we can begin creating the answer file, and we're going to go do those right now. And here we are on our Technician PC. Now we have to start by putting the Windows 7 DVD into this system. And if I go to the computer option here, you'll see that I have a volume licensed edition of a Windows 7 DVD already loaded. I happen to be using the 64-bit edition of Windows 7 for this lesson. Before we get started, I want to create a folder on the C drive that I'm just going to simply name Deploy. And this is where I'm going to place some of the files we're going to create or copy in this lesson. Now, I'm going to go back over to the Windows 7 disk, and I'm going to open it up. And inside the folders, you're going to notice that there's one folder called Sources. Inside the Sources folder, you're going to find a file called install.wim. This is an image of a Windows 7 machine. We want to copy this over to our hard drive. So I'm going to copy this file over to that deploy folder that I just created. And we'll paste it right here. So we're waiting for this to copy. It'll take it just a minute. And as you can see, the file is now done copying. Now we're going to start the Windows System Image Manager tool. So we'll go from the Start menu and we'll choose Windows System Image Manager. Now to start with, we'll go to the File menu and we'll choose to select a Windows system image that we're going to work with. So I'm going to choose Computer. And I have this Windows image that we just copied over from the Windows Deployment DVD. Now, the first thing you're going to be asked is, there's no catalog file that can be opened. Do you want to create a catalog file? You need to answer yes to this question, and you have to be an administrator on your local machine in order to answer yes. So I will click yes, and it's going to generate the catalog file, as you can see on the screen. And it might take a minute or two for this process to complete as well. When the process is complete, you'll notice that over here in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, we have a Windows image item now. This says Windows 7 Enterprise, and we've got a number of components and package items underneath that heading. I'm going to scroll Windows around a little bit to make it easier to read things. Don't get too confused by the AMD64 nomenclature you see here. AMD64 is a general name for 64-bit editions of Windows, and they'll work on both AMD and Intel processors. AMD happened to be the company that first created the 64-bit processors we use today, so they're called AMD64. That's the only reason they're called that. Now that we've added the Windows image, the first thing we have to do after that is to create our new answer file. So from the File menu, choose New Answer File. And you'll notice that there's an item that becomes populated here in the middle of the window in the Answer File section. There are a number of components, and we're going to add specific items from this component section to the component section over here. These are various aspects of the boot process or the creation process of a new operating system. And we're going to add various components from here to the various items over here. So let's do that. The first item we want to add is the Windows 7 Deployment Reseal item. So it's called Microsoft Windows Deployment Reseal. So we're going to scroll down this list. Microsoft Windows Deployment. There it is. Well, we're looking for Reseal. Now I want to right-click Reseal, and I have to decide to which component in the answer file I want to add this Reseal component. Well, I happen to know that I'm going to add this to the out-of-the-box system environment. So, OOBE system is where I want to add. It's going to be adding it to pass 7 of the installation process. And there we go. Now, I'm not going to configure any of these yet. We're going to do that in the next step. So I've added this Reseal option at step 7 of the answer file. The next option is Microsoft Windows International Core WinPE. And we're going to add the Setup UI Language option from that item. So we're looking for Microsoft Windows International Core WinPE. And you'll notice the only item underneath that is the Setup UI Language. This is going to be the user interface language we want to use for the Windows PE environment. So we'll right-click that item, and you'll notice the only place we can add that is to pass 1 WinPE. So we'll do that. Next, we're looking for Microsoft Windows Setup. So we'll go to Microsoft Windows Setup. It's a little farther down. It's in alphabetical order. And here we go. Specifically, we are looking for disk configuration, disk, create partitions. So we'll do disk configuration, disk, create partitions. There we go. So I'm going to right-click that item, and that's going to go to the WinPE environment as well. Likewise, we want to be able to modify the partition, so I'm going to add this to step 1 as well. We'll be configuring these items very soon. Next, in the setup item, we want to go to the image install, OS image install to. We'll right-click install to, and we'll add that to the WinPE step as well. Next, we're going to go to Microsoft Windows Setup User Data. So we're going to add the whole user data branch to the WinPE item. Finally, we're going to go to Microsoft Windows Shell Setup. So let's go there. And we're looking for OOBE. This is going to determine exactly how we handle the actual installation. Are we going to skip the end user license agreement page and a number of other items? So we'll right click that, and this is going to be added to pass 7, OOBE system. That's the only place we can add it. Next, we have to begin populating these items with values. So let's start at the top. Let's go right to the ones we create. We'll start with the top and work our way down. We're going to start with the Microsoft Windows International Core WinPE. Now I'm going to expand this way again so we can start seeing these items a little bit better. And I'm going to select that branch of the answer file. Now for input locale, I'm going to choose ENUS or put in ENUS. For system locale, I'm going to put ENUS. If you happen to be in a different country, put in the appropriate settings for your country or your language. For UI language and user locale, we're also going to do EN-US. And there we go. Our next step is to choose the setup UI language. And I want you to notice after we've provided settings, this little box turned blue to say, hey, we filled it in. Again, the setting is going to be ENUS, and this time we don't want to show the actual user interface during setup unless there's an error. And you're going to see this quite a bit throughout this process. You can choose to always show a particular step of the process, never show it, or only if there's an error. So if I put in a funky UI language here, you could just choose to have that screen come up so that the user would have to provide a valid value to continue on with the process. Next, we have to do our disk configuration. So I'm going to choose disk configuration. And again, I only want to show the user interface if there's an error. And this is pretty important because it's easy to make a mistake with the disk configuration. Next, we'll go to disk. And the disk ID is going to be 0. And we're going to wipe the disk. So we want to make sure we clear all the contents of the disk before we continue. This is going to add an item for us that's going to allow us to add a disk to our system later on. Or we're going to create and modify a partition in the next phase of the answer file. Next, we'll go to the create partition item. You'll notice there's not much we can do here. So we'll go to the create partition. Remember, this says create partitions. This says create partition. So there's a difference. Now we go to because you can create multiple partitions on a computer. So you could actually have multiple create partitions if you wanted to, but we don't. And I just added that one as a sample to show you that we could have multiple create partitions. We want to create a single partition on this disk. It's going to be the first one. The size is going to be 60 gigabytes. And the type is going to be a primary partition. We don't want to have to use any of these other partition types because there's no reason to for this particular example. Next, we'll go to the modify partition option. We're going to say that this is going to be an active partition because if it's not active, the system can't boot from it. It doesn't need to be an extended partition because since it's the active partition, we don't need to worry about it. We're going to create it of the NTFS file system type with a value of Win7-reference. That'll be its label when we eventually get to that step in the process. The drive letter will be drive C. The order will be 1. The partition ID will be 1. And that's going to be it for that option. We'll now move on to the OS image option. Here we'll choose install to available partition. And we're going to say false because we're going to handle this in other ways later on. And again, here we're going to say only show the UI if there's an error. So we want to make sure we set that so that the installation process doesn't bomb out. Now we have to decide to which disk or partition we want to install the OS. We've created a partition on disk ID 0 with a value of 1, partition ID 1. So we're going to install the system to disk ID 0 partition 1. If you make a mistake here, the installation will bomb out. So make sure you actually have valid partitions before you continue. Next, we want to choose whether or not to populate some user data. do we want to just automatically accept the end user license agreement? Well, we probably don't want the user to have to, as part of this process, worry about this, so we'll say true. Full name will be Global Mantix and Global Mantix. We'll just put GM in there for now. If you want to, you can also populate with a product key here, so you don't have to worry about that later on in the process. We're not going to do that for now. But again, we will show on error. When we get to the reseal option, we want to modify this a little bit. We're going to change this to an audit mode for testing. And we're not going to force a shutdown, so we're going to allow it to stay up until we decide to manually shut it down. And finally, we again want to choose to hide the end user license agreement page. So we'll say true. And protect your PC, we'll give it option 3, and we'll look at that later on. These options are going to create a very, very, very basic answer file that we're going to work with in this lesson. From the Tools menu at this point, you'll notice there's an option here to validate the answer file. You should validate your answer file to make sure you haven't forgotten something. If you choose Validate Answer File and you get no errors, life is good. There are some things that if you didn't put a value in, you're going to get an error. So if you forgot to put a partition ID in, for example, you're going to get an error. So make sure that you actually do validate your answer file before you move on. Next, we have to save this answer file. So I'm going to save the answer file as, there's a specific name you have to save it with actually, and I should tell you what that name is. AutoUnattend.xml. So save your answer file as AutoUnattend.xml. I recommend you save it to both your hard drive on your management machine as well as to your removable media. In my case, I'm going to copy this file to a floppy disk that I'm going to use in my reference computer in just a couple of minutes. So, we've created an answer file that we're going to use in our next step. Make sure that you've copied this file to removable media, otherwise the next step's not going to work. Your next step is to create the reference installation on the reference computer that you're going to use to build that initial master image for the entire organization. The reference installation is really your gold master image that will be deployed to the other computers in your organization. For this step, you need your Windows 7 media, you need that physical DVD. You also need that media or the drive with the answer file that we just created. In my case, I've created a virtual floppy disk for my machine that I'm going to use for the media for the answer file. You'll need any software that needs to be made a part of your standard image, such as Microsoft Office. Make sure you also have any drivers for any hardware that's to be included in your standard image. And you'll also need to have the sysprep utility, but that'll actually come automatically, and you'll see that in just a minute. One of the things I want to point out is you need to use the Persist All Devices Install switch on sysprep if you want to maintain hardware devices between your reference image and your deployed images. I'll discuss that later on and just as we go through the lesson. I'm going to go over to my Hyper-V environment again, and we're going to go through building and generalizing a reference installation. Now, I've created a virtual machine called GM Reference, and that's just so that we can easily see the name here as a reference installation. If I look at the settings, you'll notice that I have the Windows 7 Enterprise 64-bit English disk in as my DVD drive. And I've just got a general disk called floppy.vfd that's associated as my floppy drive for this machine. I want to make sure it's clear that this floppy disk has the answer file that we created in the previous step. What I need to do is turn on this machine. And you'll notice that it goes through its normal boot process. But one thing's going to be very different. I just made a full screen to make it easier to read, and it's going through the starting Windows process just like it normally would if you were booting from the Windows 7 installation disk. And here's your typical setup screen that you'd normally see. but notice we didn't get asked any questions. It jumped right to install Windows. We didn't get asked for an end user license agreement. We didn't get asked for about creating or choosing a partition to which to install Windows. We didn't get asked anything. That's because the answer file that we created in the previous step took care of all that for us. Windows knew, based on the values we placed in an answer file, what we wanted to do. So it didn't ask us any questions that were really unnecessary because we already provided them in the answer file. This makes it a lot easier to create reference Windows installations where you don't have to constantly answer the same questions over and over. Now I'm going to pause the video while this installation completes, and as soon as we get to a screen where we get asked something, I'll come back and we'll resume the video. Setup is completed, and here we are asking the first question of the installation. What do you want for your network location? We'll choose the work network and close. In the background, you'll notice we have the system preparation tool that's sitting here just waiting for something to happen. I mentioned before we'd see sysprep come into play here pretty soon. Well, before we do sysprep, I want to go ahead and install Office 2010 on this machine. Well, before we do that, I've got to go over and install the Office 2010 disk, because right now we've got Windows 7 loaded in the DVD drive. So I'm going to go over to my Hyper-V server and put Office 2010 in this system. Reference, settings. And when we go back over to the reference machine, we'll then kick off. Whoops, it's kicked off automatically. We'll run the setup program. And the reason we're installing Office is I want you to see at the end of this entire process that applications that are installed will actually make their way to the final image that we push out to user machines. I'm going to do a pretty typical installation of Office 2010. And again, I'm going to pause the video while Office installs because it's pretty boring watching a bar go across the screen for, just 5 or 10 minutes. So we'll pause the video and come right back. And we're back. Office is now fully installed. As you can see on the Start menu, we actually have all of the Office tools, all of Office applications are present on the Start menu. This is what we wanted to see. At this point, we want to get to a point where we run the system preparation tool against this machine now to generalize it and prepare it for imaging. So, we're going to make sure what the system cleanup action is to enter the system out-of-box experience. This is basically what you get when you buy a new computer from Dell or HP or any of the other vendors. So we'll choose Enter System Out-of-Box Experience, Generalize, and from the shutdown options list, we're going to shut the machine completely down because our next step is going to be to boot this machine with a Windows PE disk that will create and then capture this system image for later deployment to another machine. So I'm going to click the OK button to begin the preparation process with the sysprep tool. And you can see here that it says sysprep is working, processing cleanup phase, sysprep plugins. It's going to go through a whole bunch of stuff. And at the end of the process, the Windows 7 machine will just completely shut down and await further instructions. And as you can see, the system is now shutting down, logging the user off, running the Enterprise Edition of Windows 7. And the machine is now shut down. So this part of the deployment and process is complete. The machine is shut down, our reference image is ready to be captured. In order to be able to capture an image of that reference system that we just created, we need to create a bootable Windows PE disk. Windows PE will provide a minimal Windows environment that will allow us to capture and deploy system images for the remainder of this lesson. In this step, we're going to create this bootable WinPE disk. This disk will include all of the tools that are necessary to complete the process. We'll actually copy, for example, the ImageX tool to the Windows PE disk and then use that tool to capture the system image in just a little while. For this step, though, to create the bootable Windows PE Media Disk, we just need OSCD IMG. This is going to allow us to create an ISO image of a WinPE disk that we can then burn to a DVD and then boot our reference computer with. So let's go ahead and move back over to the management computer we've been using in this lesson and create a bootable Windows PE disk. Here we are over on our management computer, and the first thing we've got to do is open up the Deployment Tools command prompt. There's a specific command prompt that was installed as a part of the Deployment Tools installation that we did very early on in this process, and we're going to run that now. So from the Start menu, go to All Programs, choose Microsoft Windows AIK, right-click Deployment Tools command prompt, and choose Run as Administrator. This is going to create some pathing. We're going to add some paths to some files that we're going to need for the process. And you're going to see that some of that stuff happened right here. The first thing that we have to do is copy all of the files that we need for the particular architecture on which we're going to capture and deploy to a location that we can create an ISO file from. We are using the AMD 64 or the 64-bit version of Windows for a lot of this. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to use that architecture for all of our examples. So the first thing we've got to do is use the copy PE command. That's going to copy the pre-execution boot environment files that are necessary for the AMD 64 architecture to c:\winpe_AMD64. And you're going to see that it copied a number of files to WinPE AMD64. So that's a good thing. Now we need to copy the base image for WinPE, a Windows image file for Windows PE, to the ISO folder in that directory. Let me show you what's in that directory. As you can see, there's an ISO file that sits right here. But there's some stuff in it, but not enough quite yet. So our next step is going to be to switch to that directory, which we're already in. And we're going to copy winpe.wim, the Windows image file, to the ISO folder. /sources /boot.wim. This is going to provide the Windows execution boot environment with a Windows image from which to boot. And it's copied. Now we need the ImageX tool in order to be able to create the image from the machine that we just created earlier on in this lesson. The ImageX tool is included as a part of the Windows AIK toolkit. So I'm going to go find it. It's in Program Files, Windows AIK, Tools. We want to copy the AMD 64 edition, and we have ImageX. So I'll copy this file, and I'm going to copy it to the ISO folder that we created just a second ago. If we don't copy the ImageX file in this step, we will not have it available to us when we reboot the reference computer and try to boot to an environment from which we can grab the image. Without the ImageX file, we can't grab an image of the reference computer that we just created. So if you skip this step or miss this step, you're going to be in a world of hurt later on. Now, this is all we've got to do at this point to be ready for this. Our next step is to actually create the ISO file. So, we're going to execute the OSCD-IMG command with a -b parameter that says etfsboot.com. Notice there's no space between -b and etfsboot.com. And this is a file that sits right here. This is basically the early stage bootloader file that's necessary in order to be able to boot the system. If you don't do this part, you're not going to get very far with booting your CD-ROM drive. -U2. This is going to determine what format the ISO file is in, and this is a file format that will work for just about every new system. We're going to include hidden files just for the heck of it, and we're going to ignore any maximum size limits on images with a -M parameter. We're going to grab our files from c:\winpe, boy, if I can type, _AMD64 \ISO. We copied some stuff there, as you can see, as you saw before. In fact, we'll go take a look. There's all of our files. And we're going to create a file called winpe.iso. And this process will take a very short amount of time. And you can see it created a 168 megabyte file that's going to sit in the root folder of this system. winpe.iso. From here, we have to burn this file to a DVD. And then that DVD will then be used to reboot the reference system. Remember, when you initially installed the reference system, you had to put a DVD in the drive. Remember? The Windows 7 DVD. Now you're going to reboot the reference system using this DVD, and we're going to do that in the next step of this lesson. So what we've just completed is creating the Windows PE disk that we need to boot the reference machine with. Now we're up to the point where we're going to capture the installation from the reference computer. As you can see, our target here is the reference computer, and the purpose of this step is to capturize the generalized version of the reference image and save it to a network share. I've already created a network share on a server called GM-File for my purposes here. This is the Global Mantic file server, and this is where Global Mantic will store its image files for Windows 7. For this to work, you need the Windows PE boot disk that we just created, and it makes sure that that includes the ImageX tool from the Windows AIK. And for us, it is included on the Windows PE Media. You also have to make sure at this point that you have network connectivity. If you don't, you're not going to be able to capture your installation image to a network share. The command we're going to use to capture the installation image sits right here, and you're going to see this in just a couple of minutes. But for now, we're going to go back over to our reference computer, and we're going to capture its installation in this step. Here we are back at the reference computer that we were creating. And I'm going to change the settings for this computer. I'm going to eject the floppy disk because we don't need that answer file anymore. And I'm going to insert my Windows PE disk that I just created, windowspe.iso. So if you're on a physical computer, we would have just hit the eject button on the floppy disk and we just inserted our Windows PE boot disk. Now remember, this computer has an operating system. The first time we booted it up, it did not have an operating system, so it booted from the CD-ROM drive automatically. This time, however, it's going to tell us that we need to push a key to boot from the CD or DVD, which I just did to make sure that we can actually boot from the right media. And we'll know soon if I actually did the right step, or if it's booting from the hard drive, because if it boots up to a full Windows installation, I didn't get it in time, but if it boots to basically a command prompt, then I did get the things in time. And as you can see, it did indeed boot to a command prompt. This is a Windows PE environment that we're at right now. So our first step in this process is to actually capture our image. And if we start moving around here, you're going to see that we actually have our full Windows image. Actually, let's go to Program Files. You should see Office. Microsoft Office. So, as you can see, this is the machine that we've been working with. Now, the drive X here is our Windows pre-execution boot environment installation, so that's what we're working from right now. My goal here is to now type ImageX /capture. I want to capture the C drive on this particular system. And I'm going to save it right to the C drive because I don't need to worry about accidentally capturing it more than once. I'm going to name it GM Global Mantic Desktop Image. And I'm going to compress it with fast compression, and I want to verify that it's all good. And I'm going to hit enter. Whoops. I'm going to do that over again from the right place. It was on the D drive, sorry. So after I executed that command, it's actually running through everything right now. These are some files that are going to be excluded from the image capture by default. Now what you're seeing here is that there are some, basically some command prompt files. Your page files down here, you don't need that in a system capture. Your hibernation file, your recycle bin, things like that. You truly don't need in a generalized image. You don't really want to roll out new systems with a predefined page file that's just going to get blown away on startup anyway. All that does is take up unnecessary space in the image that you're just going to have to push down the network to other machines later on. So by default, this ImageX tool will actually exclude specific files that you see on the screen. Now, as you can see, the image capture is in progress and it's 1% done. This process takes quite some time, so I am actually going to go over and pause this lesson again, and as soon as this is done, we'll come back, and it'll tell you after a minute here that you're at about 22 minutes it's going to take for this particular image to be captured. The time that it takes the image to be captured is directly proportional to how much data you're trying to capture. If you've expanded the system image with tons and tons and tons of software, it's going to take it more time to capture the image because there's more to capture. If it's a relatively thin image, it's not going to take that much time at all, but this time will fluctuate for the time being. We'll come right back as soon as this is done. As you can see, this process took about 15 minutes and 21 seconds. And if we go over to the C drive now, we're going to see that new file that we created right here. It's about 4 gigs, gm-image.wim. Now the next step for us is to get it off this machine and get it to somewhere where it's usable. So we're going to copy it up the GM file. To do that, we're going to use the netuse command, and we're going to connect drive P to //file /images. We have to provide a username and password for this. Now you're going to notice I've already got some files out here. I'm going to delete these because these were for testing. And we'll go back to our C drive, and I'm going to copy this image up. So I'm going to copy to drive P. And again, this process is going to take a couple of minutes because that's actually a pretty large file, 4 gigs. So I'll pause the video and we'll come back. And you can see that we're done now. So we have just completed the process of capturing our reference image. One of the things you're going to notice here is once we go back over to the Hyper-V Manager, we have a new computer image here that we're going to work with in just a couple of minutes. For now, I want to go back to the presentation and go through the next part of the process, which is deploying to a target computer via a network share. Again, our target in this case is going to be a new target computer, and we're going to deploy the image we just captured to this new computer. All we need for this is the Windows PE boot disk that we created and some network connectivity. Specifically, we need access to the network share to which the reference image was saved. This is a command we're going to use later on in the process, and you're going to see this working out in just a minute. It's pretty cool, actually, when it all comes together. So I'm going to go back over to my Hyper-V machine, and this time I'm going to work with the target computer, the one that you just saw that was called New Computer. And we'll go over there right now. So in my new computer, I want to install or insert that Windows PE boot disk that we created before. So from the image file, on the image file here, I'll go and I'll insert that Windows PE boot disk. It's hard to see the screen. And click OK. As you can see, this machine is turned off. We're going to turn this machine on, and we're going to go to full screen mode. Now shortly this machine is going to boot to the Windows pre-execution boot environment, the command prompt that we just saw. Now before we can actually just grab that image and load it on this machine, we've got to partition this drive. And we're going to do that using the diskpart command that's available in the Windows pre-execution boot environment. This will allow us to create modified disk partitions. But before we do that, I'm going to connect to the share that we created for the images. I'm going to provide a username. And the command completed successfully. And if we go over here, there's our Windows image file that we needed in order to be able to do the work. Now, I said I've got to create some disk partition stuff. So I just typed diskpart for the disk partition utility at the command prompt. And there's a few commands that we're going to type. First of all, we're going to select disk 0. This is going to tell us I want to make sure that I'm targeting the right hard disk in the computer for the actions I'm about to take. Then I want to clean it. I want to make sure that it's ready for me to be able to put new stuff on. I'm then going to create a primary partition. So I'm going to type create partition primary 60 gigs. Size equals 60 gigs. So diskpart succeeded in creating the specified partition. I'm now going to select the new partition. Select partition 1. So it tells me that partition 1 is now the selected partition. Now that partition is not formatted. So I have to format this partition choosing a file system that I want to use. So I'm going to type format file system equals NTFS. And the label is going to be GM-system. This will be the disk label that we use. Just like any disk format procedure, this process is going to take a few minutes, so I'll pause the video and we'll come back as soon as this is done. The format's complete. So at the disk part now, we've created a partition, we've formatted it, and our next step is to assign it a letter. So we'll type assign. Wow, I can't type tonight. Letter equals C. And that was a successful process. Very important. A single word will make or break your entire deployment. Type active. If you don't, your system will not boot later on. Very critical that you do that. That's the end of having to manage the partitions. Make sure that you do that active piece. If you don't, you're just not going to be in a happy place when you're done with this. So exit this partitioner. Now, we need to be able to go back over to that share that we created and copy that Windows image down to this machine. So I'm going to we'll go to the D drive. This is where ImageX sits. ImageX/apply. This time we're going to apply an image. And it's the P drive /gm-image.wim 1C. It is now applying the image that we just captured from gm-reference to gm-new computer on localhost. So we're grabbing the image from the network and putting it on the C drive. And again, as you can tell, this process is going to take just a few minutes. I don't think you really want to sit here for 7 minutes watching this increase. So I'm going to go pause the video and we'll come right back. Now that process took about 6 minutes and 4 seconds, and that's put the image on the C drive. And you can see it here. There's one last step we need to make. We need to take before we can call this a success. We're going to go to the System32 folder on our new system here, and there's a file there called bcdboot. This is going to allow us to tell the system which Windows installation from which it should boot. So we're going to run bcdboot, and we're going to tell it uc:\Windows and the C drive. Hit return, and it's going to say the boot files were successfully created. Now, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to test this system to see if it actually works. So I'm going to minimize that system. It went through a short installation process, and now you're going to see that setup is preparing your computer for first use. This is similar to a message you would see if you bought a new computer from the likes of Dell or HP. The first question you get is what language or locality information do you want to include in this particular installation? Well, here we go. United States English US keyboard type. It's not asking for all of the general information that it normally would. So I'm going to call this gm-new just because it's a new PC for Global Mantic. What do I want for a local password? Do I accept the end user license agreement? And what do I want to do for Windows Update settings? And we'll be talking about Windows Update settings later in this course, but I'll use the recommended settings for now. And I want to set it for Central Time, because that's where I am, and click Next. We're using a work network. And now you're going to see that Windows is finalizing my settings. There was nowhere near the involved process that was necessary with a regular old everyday installation of Windows. So this is a lighter touch installation that asks the users just a few very basic questions about their particular installation. And it's important that it does ask those questions, because you may have a company that is global, and therefore you have different location information, for example, for keyboard layouts or language, or what have you, that you want to make sure that your users have an opportunity to select from to make sure that they end up with things that are in the right languages. And it's logged in to the desktop. And the first thing I want to show you is this is truly a customized image. Because if I go to the Start menu, All Programs, there's that Microsoft Office installation that we installed way back when we created the reference image. So, this truly is the customized image that we created. Pretty cool. You'll notice that it is not joined to the domain. We did not use the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, so we didn't have an opportunity to script joining the machine to the domain. However, for Global Mantic, the IT group will be actually creating all of the images locally and joining them by hand to the local domain. Another tool that's included in the Windows AIK is the User State Migration tool. This is basically the easy transfer tool that we looked at earlier in this course, but it's for enterprise users. You can do this, basically use this tool to move en masse profiles between systems. This will capture user accounts, files, operating system settings, and even application settings, and migrate these settings from an older edition of Windows to a new Windows 7 installation. What you saw in this lesson was not a fully automated installation method. This was a semi-automated installation method because there are still some manual steps you have to take in order to prepare a system for use. Windows Deployment Services, along with the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, will help you fully automate your deployment strategy. Windows Deployment Services is a component of Windows Server 2008 R2. This replaces the older remote installation services and automated deployment services tools that came with older versions of Windows. It provides automated network-based installation of Windows servers and desktop computers, and it extends the capabilities of the Windows AIK. It also offers you an opportunity to script specific actions at various points in time. For example, post-deployment, you could script an action to automatically join the Windows 7 computer to the Active Directory domain so that you could actually ship a brand new imaged computer to a user and they could just start using it. This lesson was pretty complex, but it was also basic at the same time. We actually started with nothing, and we created a fully deployable image that we can move to as many machines as we like within Global Mantix. We focused on one strategy for deployment so that you could understand the process from start to finish. There's a whole lot more you can do, and I highly encourage you to play with this in your own lab environment and to really cover some of the resource materials that you're going to find attached later on in this lesson. You'll see them in a minute. We talked about the Global Mantix deployment plan, and we talked about, after that, some Windows 7 deployment enhancements that make the deployment process a lot easier in Windows 7. We covered the specific lesson goals, which I just reiterated, which were to understand the process from start to finish. We discussed the different deployment types, as well as some pre-deployment tools that you can and should review before you take your exam, and before you actually start using the deployment tools in any serious way in your own organization. We looked at the differences between thick and thin images and then looked at some additional deployment strategies. We then moved on to understanding the tools that are available for system image capture and deployment and looked at some image deployment options. You then got a look at the capture and deployment process overview from start to finish. That was really the brunt of this lesson. We touched on the user state migration tool and then talked about some automated installation methods. There are a whole lot of terms that you should understand from this lesson, including all of the terms that you see on your screen. Make sure you truly understand exactly what's being talked about and the differences between all of the various imaging tools and image capturing tools so that you can use them in your own environment and in exam scenarios. For this lesson, I've included a number of supporting resources as well, including choosing your deployment strategy, full Windows 7 desktop deployment overview, step-by-step, the basic Windows deployment for IT professionals. You're going to find that this step-by-step lesson is very similar to the one we undertook in this lesson, and it's very repeatable. Now, the goal here, again, was to make this repeatable so you can do this in your own lab. Microsoft's also made a Springboard series available for a work template for a Windows 7 deployment plan. There's some information about getting started with the AIK, as well as the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and Windows Deployment Services. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.